Welcome everyone to this BIA webinar on the autumn statement delivered on Wednesday. We're going to be exploring what it means for the life sciences sector. So thank you for joining us. We've still got a few people coming in, but I will, if my screen will work, move us on to the introductions of our great panel that we've got today. So I am Martin Turner, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the BIA. We also have Steve Bates, CEO of the BIA, Colin Haley, Chair of our Finance and Tax Committee, Melissa Strange, CFO at Brainomics and also Vice Chair of our Finance and Tax Committee, and finally Richard Turner, Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting and a member of our Finance and Tax Committee. And together, this is the team that have been leading our work on R&D tax credits and many other finance and tax issues on behalf of all members. So, on to the big event. On Wednesday, the Chancellor delivered what could be, but probably wasn't, his last fiscal event before a general election. He sought to show a pro-growth agenda, delivering tax cuts for businesses and workers to the tune of £20 billion. He announced measures to support entrepreneurs raising new capital, and he sought to support the UK's fastest growing businesses, singling out the life sciences industry, which he said he was incredibly proud of. He noted that more lives have been saved by UK developed vaccines than any other country worldwide. It really was a very large package of support that he delivered for life sciences. We're going to pick through all of the detail in this webinar, but we've chosen a few key announcements just to highlight straight at the beginning. 520 million in capital grants to support life sciences manufacturing investments, improvements to the R&D tax relief regime for R&D intensive SMEs, full expensing for capital allowances made permanent, further pension reforms and programs to unlock investment, 50 million for the Future Fund breakthrough, and new investment zones highlighting the strength of UK and the value of life sciences across the UK. I mean, Steve, if I could turn to you first, I mean, it was a large package of support. What was your initial take from this?
Yeah, it's been a really big and positive week, I think. What a difference a year makes. If you think about it, last year we were facing the fact that R&D tax credits had been cut. We didn't know whether the pension agenda was real. And if I look at what's happened this week, and I think you have to look slightly beyond the autumn statement to get the big picture, we've seen progress on many fronts. Crucially, we've got the new voluntary pricing and access and growth agreement, the VPAG, the new VPAS has been agreed. I know not everybody's very happy about everything, but that has been done. So we're clear. We've got a clear way forward for 5 years on that. We've had the spin-out review, looking at how you can help get new companies started faster and quicker. The Life Science Council, the clinical trials and the MHRA backlogs are going in the right direction, and there's been progress there. And if you look at the big agendas that we've been working on at the BIA, it's great to see that pension fund money coming in the direction of innovative parts of the economy, and lots of different pieces of that I think are coming together, not just last week, but through the last 6 months. The work we've done on manufacturing has been multi-year, so it's fantastic to see a substantial £500 million for the UK life science manufacturing investment, thanks to the work we've done through Manufacturing Advisory Committee and through MMIP. So it's great to see that. And then I think we're going to focus more on some of the detail around R&D tax credits. Again, thanks to the campaigning of BIA members, I think the changes that we've seen both in the rate at the last fiscal event and in the thresholds at this event are really positive for the sector, and that's down to your hard work. So thank you. Particular thanks to the Finance and Tax Advisory Committee and yourself, Martin, but really to the membership as a whole. That wouldn't have happened without your hard work. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of what was announced today was also welcomed by Rachel Reeves. I mean, Steve, how do you think this is playing out politically in lead up to a general election?
Well, I think at risk of saying it, but I think we might have some stability breaking out. I think the fact that there is a degree of political consensus around much of this growth agenda. And in a sense, you see Rachel Reeves saying, well, he's announced what I was going to do anyway. Does mean that as we look through 24, we might be thinking, well, general election, there'll be big change. But I actually think in a core part of this business investment piece, we stand a better chance of stability. So I think we can, with some confidence, look at some of these initiatives and think, actually, this is a platform which will be around for a while.
Yeah, thank you. Right, I should have said at the top of the shop that we will, of course, be taking questions at the end. We're going to go through everything that's been announced, try and unpick some of the detail, but please do use the Q&A function when you want to ask a question, and we'll get to those at the end. So fiscal events, the autumn statement is all about government investment in programmes and also tax, of course. So to unpack some of those major announcements that we highlighted and go into a bit more detail. So the 520 million for life sciences manufacturing, these will be grants to support capital investments into manufacturing facilities. They will be available to domestic companies and foreign companies as well. And the whole idea is to anchor manufacturing in the UK. New investment zones, these have been around for a while, but these are tax and other support measures that will be available within certain zones. And a new one was announced at the autumn statement in West Yorkshire, focused around the health tech community that they've got there. So that's really good to see. On unlocking pension funds, this has, of course, been something that BIA has campaigned for quite some time. And there was a lot both on reforms to how pension funds are run, a lot of consolidation of small schemes that aren't really performing very well to enable savers to get better returns from more efficient investment, but also invest into growing areas of the economy and particularly into venture capital. And this is something BIA has, of course, campaigned very heavily for. The British Business Bank will be setting up a new growth fund, which will be essentially a fund of funds that will allow pension funds to invest into the portfolio of the British Business Bank, which has built up over the past few years. 50 million will be made available for the Future Fund Breakthrough Scheme. This is building on the 375 announced a few years ago, and this is a direct investment fund into companies. Many BIA members have already got funding for this, and it's to support scaling life science companies. We're really pleased to see the VC fellowship scheme get over the line. This is something that the BIA supported and actually proposed originally in the Life Sciences Scale-Up Task Force, which was quite a few prime ministers ago now, but it's finally got over the line, which we're really pleased to see. And this is going to nurture the next generation of VCs so that those pension funds can work with really talented, expert life science VC investors to allocate pensioners' capital to life science companies. And then finally, long-term investment in technology and science competition. Again, announced about a year ago. The competition has been running over the past year. This is bringing together pension funds and VCs to bid for up to 250 million from the British Business Bank to enable those consortiums to then invest into technology and science companies. We don't quite know the winners yet. The autumn statement said that there are two winners chosen that will get the 250 million, but they're just going through final due diligence checks on those before announcing, but we're hoping to see those before Christmas. And Steve, both manufacturing and pensions, key areas for the BIA. Very good to see this.
Yeah, absolutely, Martin. I mean, thank you. I mean, you can see this is where the long-term work has paid off. It really has been a long trudge up hills on some of these things, but I hope people can see that we talk a lot about that pension funds agenda. You can see it's moving in multiple ways. Lots of these jigsaw pieces will come together to give the big picture, but you can see it's really moving. And I think also what we're seeing is lots of interest from both the pension community and VCs in this, and I think it's breaking out globally. The UK is really being noticed on this one. Yeah,
definitely. Steve already mentioned the spin-out review was published, wide range of recommendations. This is, again, BIA engaged in this process, and it's good to see some of the recommendations that we and our members have championed, have been accepted by the government. And also there's been new investment, 20 million to support spin-outs to conduct proof of concept projects. Waiting to see exactly how that will be allocated, but that is positive as well. And then we've seen a cohort of investments in computing, manufacturing centre of excellence for oligonucleotides, Fleming Centre at Imperial for new medicines, and some exciting extra investment into the UK's data capabilities. Again, Steve, really good to see this.
Yep, sorry, coming off mute. Yeah, I think it goes to show all the way across some exciting stuff, and that rare therapies launchpad is really interesting. How you bring together the MHRA, people making drugs for patients with single genetic disorders is a really interesting piece of work as well. So I hope what it will do is spark excitement in our sector globally and make things easier around the piece. We know it's globally markets haven't been straightforward, but actually I think you can see whilst Nasdaq's been asleep, we certainly haven't in the UK, and it's nice to be able to launch this in the Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah, and again, as has been mentioned, a lot of reviews published alongside the autumn statement, and the government's full response to the O'Shaughnessy review into commercial clinical trials is published. So still working through the detail of that, but some of the money that was announced previously by the government has now been specifically allocated to as 20 million to support this dementia-focused clinical trials accelerator. So that's really really interesting. On skills, 50 million committed to deliver 2-year apprenticeship pilots to stimulate training for growth sectors such as life sciences. Positive to see. And then medicines pricing, as Steve already talked about, the industry and government have come together and settled a deal for medicines pricing. Mel, I mean, what in the autumn statement so far has catched your eye here?
Well, just on these ones in particular, I think the actual acknowledgement of the frustrating issues that have been faced and are being faced by for those looking to run and participate in clinical trials in the UK, and actually coming up with recommendations to address those is a really positive sign. And as always, any steps or actions that are taken to support companies in bringing in new talent and possibly a diverse range of talent is always welcome.
Yeah.
And so moving on from that, just having before I steal people's thunders, and Colin and Richard will go into far more detail than this, I just wanted to run through the main announcements in Wednesday's statement, and particularly on the R&D tax side, which is I know where a lot of interest will be and is very close to my heart in particular. We did see the drop in R&D intensity threshold from 40 to 30%, and you'll hear a little bit more about what that means for us shortly. And this will also be coupled by a grace period, so it's definitely not a one strike and you're out rule coming in. Players will also be able to include subsidised expenditure. Again, you'll hear why this is really important for us, and particularly for a number of companies I'm involved with. And for loss-making companies, there's been an increase in the cash that can be received up front. Again, another great win for us. As part of this, obviously, the Chancellor also confirmed that the R&D tax relief review was now finished, but there was a bit of a caveat on that, so we shall see what happens on that. And then turning to some other tax measures outside of the R&D framework. As you can see on the slide, full expensing of capital allowances will be made permanent, which was great for those kind of scaling companies, and the EIS and VCT sunset clauses will be extended to 2035.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, as Steve said, what a difference a year makes. So we just thought it'd be useful to go back to a year ago, 17th of November 2022, when the sector was really shocked to see the Chancellor announce that he was cutting the SME R&D tax credit scheme down to effectively 18.6p for every pound invested, down from 33p. So it's a huge shock to the sector, and we quickly rallied as a sector. 300 CEOs signed a letter to the Chancellor raising our serious concerns about this. MPs joined us to raise these concerns in Parliament, and we secured 2 roundtables with the responsible minister, Victoria Atkins, And then later, just before Christmas, got a letter from the Chancellor saying that he had heard us, he listened, and that he would look at providing further support. And that further support did come. At the spring budget, we got this new enhanced rate of 27p for R&D intensive SMEs, and this brought in this new concept of the R&D intensive SME scheme that we're going to see unpicked and explained by Colin and Richard. We, of course, didn't rest on our laurels after that. We've continued to work both on the detail of the new legislation that was coming through that was published as draft legislation before Parliament. We've continued to use our many links into government through things like the Life Sciences Council and the Business Environment Board to highlight the challenges that are ongoing and still very prescient for many of all of our members, really. And Colin has continued to make appearances in front of the House of Lords Finance Bill Subcommittee to again press on the legislators that there are some serious issues here that really do need to be unpicked and addressed. So that really brought us to today's, or Wednesday's rather, announcements. And I'm now going to hand over to Colin to take us through the detail of what was announced for R&D tax credits.
Thank you very much, Martin. So we'll run through sort of the headlines and then do a bit more on the detail. But on R&D tax credits, the headlines are, firstly, we have confirmation that it will now be a merged scheme. So where we get to is a merged scheme for all sizes of company on R&D tax relief, and then also an R&D intensive scheme for R&D intensive SMEs. Those will be the two schemes going forward for accounting periods beginning on or after 1st of April 2024. So, what we've had historically was an RDEC scheme effectively for large companies and an SME scheme for small companies. We're now going into a merged scheme for all sizes of companies and an R&D intensive scheme for certain SMEs. As Mel's already mentioned, the full cost of subsidised R&D can be claimed. So awkward rules about, what's a grant-funded project will be swept away under the new rules. All projects will be ranked equally. A big and very useful win is on what company gets into the R&D intensive scheme. Well, you need a research intensity threshold to be met, and the autumn statement announced they're bringing that limit down. It's coming down from 40% down to 30%. And also, as Mel mentioned, there'll be a grace period in terms of making sure you don't drop in and out of the rules inadvertently. And then slightly more in the detail on subcontracting, we're getting some movement on subcontracting where what the tax system is trying to achieve is making sure the right people can claim, but importantly, you don't get double claiming, that you don't get basically the customer and the subcontractor both claiming on the same spend. That it wasn't quite right in it wasn't perfect in the original draft of the rules. We're now getting some improved drafting that we hope to see when the draft finance bill clauses come out in about a week's time. We do still have work to do as a Finance and Tax Advisory Committee. There's some guidance required from HMRC on how we go about working out what's an R&D intensive company, and I'll touch on that in the next slide, please, Martin.
I'm trying to do it. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so research intensive schemes. So you need to be an SME and you need to be research intensive. If you meet those two requirements, then your R&D tax credit will be at 27%. So where we were pre last year's autumn statement was at basically about a 33% rate. Where we got to after the autumn statement was down to about 18%. We're now back up to about 27%. So not back to where we'd like to be, but an awful lot better. And companies will be trying very hard to get into the research intensive scheme. So there's a threshold to work out, are you research intensive? You take your R&D expenditure that qualifies for your R&D credit, divide it by your total expenditure, and what number do you get? If that number is 30% or more, you could be considered research intensive. It was going to be 40%. They've lowered it to 30%. That's a significant move from the Treasury. The Treasury came up with these percentages. It remains to be seen how good they are and how easy it will be. And I know Richard will come on to talk about some of the problems in detail with working out your R&D intensity. not least because you have to work out what of my spend qualifies as R&D. And there's this issue about, well, if you're putting subcontracted expenditure into that calculation and the work is going to be done overseas, can you include that work or can you not? And that's where we need more guidance from HMRC. Another important point, and one we pushed very hard for with the Treasury, was this issue of would you find yourself dropping in and out of the research intensive scheme? Because you do the calculation each year, and let's say you had a big share option charge in one year that goes in the bottom of the fraction, suddenly you'd say, well, I'm doing the clinical trials I was doing before, but suddenly I'm no longer research intensive because I've got a lot of other expenditure in the bottom of the fraction. So there's now going to be a year of grace, effectively. If you were research intensive last year, you will be research intensive in the next year. It's similar, we haven't got the detail yet, but it sounds similar to what already exists in the SME scheme with a year of grace. So that's very welcome. It gives a lot more certainty to business planning. So that's on the research intensive scheme. If you can't get into that scheme, there's the new merge scheme. So all sizes of companies, you know, whether you're GSK or a small biotech, you'll be reading the same rules to say, well, in this merge scheme, what R&D relief do I get? Essentially, there's a new rate of credit. It'll be a 20% rate of credit, but from a cash flow point of view, if you're a loss-making company, the way they make these rules work is the credit itself is taxable. So you're getting a 20% credit, but you will then basically get tax knocked off that credit. So if you're a small company that's loss-making, or a loss-making company, you knock off 19% tax off the 20%, which is how you get to the 16.2 pence in the pound at the bottom of that slide. It's just the way the tax system works and the way accounting works. We don't have time to cover all the detail here, but essentially where you're going to be is if you're research intensive, you're at 27%. If you're not and you're in the merge scheme, you'll be at 16.2%. But as with the existing rules, contracted out R&D is subject to a further 65% restriction. So you lose 35% of the credit. You end up at 10.5p for contracted out R&D. I appreciate there's a lot of numbers there, but essentially we're getting to somewhere where on the research intensive scheme, we're close to where we used to be under the old scheme. In the merge scheme, you are actually better off than you were under the old scheme. So I think all in all, given where we were after last year's autumn statement, when me and others were very rude about the Chancellor, I think we're in a much better place now. Next slide, please, Martin. Subsidised R&D. So there was an existing restriction in the SME scheme that said if you got someone else basically picking up some or all of your costs on an R&D project, then that restricted the amount of R&D relief you've got. They're sweeping all of that away. I know Richard will come on to cover in more detail what that means, but that's a very welcome measure, a very significant measure. You can read your R&D tax relief rules completely independently from whether you're getting, for example, a grant on a project or not. So what happens next? We've got a finance bill expected, I think, next week. We should see some draft legislation, and this would then come in next year. So as I said at the top of this section, these changes will be for accounting periods beginning on or after 1st of April 2024. So again, gives more time, and that's another move in the new rules, gives more time for businesses to adapt to these rules and work out what it all means. We continue to have work to do as a Finance and Tax Committee to get some more guidance out of HMRC on the overseas expenditure restriction I mentioned. You know, we've got a subcontractor doing their work outside the UK as to whether you can include that cost in your R&D tax credit and in your calculation of being an R&D intensive SME or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. And like you said, I think these are significant improvements, and thanks to all the evidence and data that our members have provided to us over the past year, you know, we've been able to put in really good evidence to HMT, to Treasury and HMRC to help them make these decisions. And I think it's fair to say they've engaged with us very constructively. You know, not everything's perfect, and like you say, there's more detail to be published that we really need to see, but it's been a positive experience from my point of view, and a good level of engagement from both members and the government. So, Richard, what does this mean for members?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so I'll cover some of the practical implications. So starting with subsidised R&D, it's a very welcome simplification because it caused, beyond the sort of the principal concept, it caused a lot of thorny issues for companies. Whether something's a state, particularly where something was a state aid, where it could potentially knock out the whole project. So you do have to wait for accounting periods on or after April 24, but at that point then subsidies go away totally. So when you're getting a grant, that is the true benefit of what you're going to receive, and you don't have to discount any lost R&D tax credits from it. Just a bit of background to why we had that. When they were looking at merging the regimes, then the question came in is, do we keep the subsidy rule in? It would have been completely incoherent to have that in the RDEC regime. So it had really to come out for that part. And what was a very welcome simplification is they decided to take that out of the research intensive piece as well. We thought it might stay in there, but that coming out was a very welcome relief. So with 40% coming down to 30%, and many more companies now will hopefully be eligible for this higher rate. When we first modelled the position at 40%, we had concern. We had concern with companies that, particularly, let's say, listed companies that have a certain level of overhead that would go into the denominator. But even more interestingly, companies at, phase 2B and 3, where you're losing 35% of your contracted out R&D, they were quite quickly coming to that 40% threshold. So, coming down to 30% will give much more headway, and I think that gives a much more sensible threshold intuitively for companies in the space. Having said that, we're going to have to properly understand the calculation. Colin alluded to some of those challenges. The definition when it was first presented back in the spring has changed from the draft legislation. At that point, we were looking at the global consolidated group to do that fraction. The legislation in the summer suggested you might just look at UK companies. That's going to need to be thought about, because what HMRC wouldn't want to happen is for companies to suddenly siphon off non-R&D expenditure overseas in order to boost their research intensity calculation. And we want this to work. We need this to work for our sector. So we need a set of rules that are going to be easily operable, and we don't really want companies taking advantage of that. So still a lot of uncertainty into exactly how that calculation is going to be made. We'll hopefully get some clarity, some level of clarity next week with the finance bill. We might have to wait till the guidance is released, which we're expecting a few weeks after that, maybe early in the new year. But once that's out, don't take for granted that you are, do the calculation, make sure you understand the calculation and what it means for your business, because that difference between 27 versus 16.2 is obviously quite significant. And then really a sense of deja vu, because I probably said exactly the same thing 12 months ago. Now, thankfully, this is around the restrictions on overseas R&D. Thankfully, that got pushed back a year, but it is still definitely coming in, and it's probably going to be quite complex. When the measure was first introduced, and was introduced in its skeleton form, the belief was actually a lot of expenditure was simply fall away from the R&D claim. Now, again, with some hard work and lots of discussion, we managed to get I think a reasonably sensibly crafted exemption where there are conditions that exist outside the UK, meaning that R&D has to be undertaken there. But you are, and this is what I was saying 12 months ago, you'll be entering into contracts now that will extend into the new period. For December year ends, that's from 1 January next year, but for some companies earlier. A couple of points to look out for. Be reminded this relates to activities, so that is subcontracted R&D and contractors. So it doesn't relate to the sourcing materials. Now, when we get into the space of contracting with CMOs, CDMOs, it's never black and white whether something is genuinely a consumable or is it a service, and sometimes there's a mixture of both. Where you have some ability to probably influence how those contractual arrangements are set up, you really want to have those contracts expressed as a delivery of materials, and therefore to be explicit transfer of title and payment for that. It may be stage payments leading up to that, it may be on an FTE basis, but those contracts need to be expressed as the supply of materials, and there's a double whammy there. Firstly, it falls outside these rules totally, but secondly, you'll get R&D on 100% of the cost rather than 65% of the cost. And then with your clinical trials, probably best to consider that in two areas. One is site-based activity. Now, this is a big simplification, but I think that the limitation there is what, in terms of patient population, you might be able to have recruited in the UK. And that is an oversimplification, but that may give you a steer on what level of threshold you might need to make to be able to justify bringing in that cost. And it may be, for example, that if you have a trial of, let's say, 100 patients, and on hindsight, and you can use that, we confirmed you can use hindsight. On hindsight, you said, well, we could have recruited 20 of those in the UK, but in the end, we recruited them all from overseas. It maybe you can take the position you can still nevertheless claim 80% of the cost. Now, we still have to clarify these positions with HMRC, but hopefully that gives some confidence. I think quite a lot of the overseas R&D should still stick, but you will need the evidence. The other aspect, of course, is where the CRO is doing, let's say, called their central work. That's their project management, their data analysis. You're going to need to know where that is undertaken. In most cases, if you're dealing with a global CRO that has presence in the UK, if that's been undertaken elsewhere, then it'll be difficult to justify that it couldn't have been undertaken in the UK. So that's something that's need to be considered. We're hopefully going to get, and try and get to a position we get much more clarity on that. But these are things to be thinking about. But as a minimum, you should be ensuring you're getting information from your CRO so you know where those activities are being undertaken. And then the last piece is around contracted out R&D. We've long had the challenge where R&D is disaggregated because of necessity and because of the business model, and a concept we're now calling as fragmented R&D. That's where part of the R&D project is contracted out to a third party. So most notably, let's say, a CRO running a clinical trial. But legislation has never really adequately dealt with that. The likelihood is that, or not necessarily likelihood, or possibility that the draft legislation for the merge regime may address this more explicitly. And through discussions with HMT, we don't think this has yet been properly addressed. So now, as things stand, if you are a service provider and you're providing services to a UK company, then you won't be able to claim, because now this is under the merge regime. Now it will be the customer who can make that claim. Having said that, because of the overseas restrictions, you'll be now in a much more competitive position, because you're a UK supplier and people won't have to rely on the overseas exemption to be able to claim the cost. So do bear that in mind. But if you are providing services to an overseas company, that's when it may be a challenge, and we'll be doing some work to try and see if we can get that, because we believe it is still in intention in terms of policy to try and get that into the ambit of the UK R&D regime. So there, we said, we really welcome a call for evidence. So for those service providers who can say that, if we are entitled to credits, it will mean a positive investment in the UK, in our UK footprint, examples of that nature would be extremely powerful.
Yeah, and actually, I'd extend the call for evidence to all BIA members and other biotechs. We're very keen to hear what you think of these measures, how you think the 40% and now 30% threshold is going to bite. And of course, although we've got more details to come, how the overseas restrictions are likely to impact you as well. You know, we can only feed these things back to Treasury and HMRC if you tell us about them, so please do get in touch. Mel, you're obviously a CFO of a company and you advise quite a few other companies. What are you thinking of doing or already doing in response to this?
So I think a couple of things that really kind of stand out for me for this is just keep an eye on what that detailed guidance is around the research intensity, because for companies and some of the ones that I work with, where we've got a changing cost base, perhaps as we head towards commercialization and you start having some of your launch costs coming in, or you have your selling costs, all those have a different kind of funding model where you may have more corporate costs going in. Hopefully that means we can stay within the kind of the R&D intensity rate for a little bit longer. Obviously, it's really important we see what that looks like. But that's say I'm definitely keeping an eye on that one. And then also, I think the other one is the bit that gives me a little bit of joy inside, which was about the removal of the subsidised expenditure rules, because I spent many years kind of stripping things out of one bit of my claim and putting it in another. And I think this is we probably don't sing enough about how much of a win this could be, because there's a huge element of cost that used to get excluded, which we'll now be able to include back in again.
Thanks. And Richard, I mean, we focused a lot here on R&D tax credits because we love them so much, don't we? But there were some other very important tax measures. So can you just briefly take us through those?
Well, yes. I mean, the Chancellor committed to now a permanent instatement of the full expensing of capital allowances. So essentially, that's plant and machinery. You'll get a full deduction in the year of expenditure. If I cast my mind back a few years, the UK capital allowance regime was very uncompetitive. I think we were 17th in the G20. Now with full expensing, we're much higher up that list. Making this permanent, I think, is a really important signal, allowing, you know, and I know it's not necessarily going to probably impact the typical BIA member, not all of them, but for those who are investing in, you know, manufacturing facilities or large facilities, or looking to invest in the UK, they can do so with confidence now that the regime isn't going to, you know, be changing every year, 1 year to the next. And the same goes to say for the EIS and VCT, now extended to 2035. You know, we've always had these sort of short-term sunset clauses, but to have that window now out for over a decade, I think it is very good, and people can invest with confidence. Yeah, no, and it's worth mentioning Labour have supported that full expensing announcement as well, so I think it should be properly permanent. Right, I see we've got some questions that have already come in, which is great. Please do keep them coming. Colin, I'm going to go to you first. The question: will we be able to or need to claim on both schemes like we currently do?
I think there's three big tests you need to meet to be in the R&D intensive scheme. That's the one you want to be in, because that's at 27% rate of credit rather than 16.2. You need to be an SME, you need to be R&D intensive, and you can't have the work subcontracted to you by somebody else. So you're doing the work on your own account, not as a customer. Sorry, not as a subcontractor. If you meet those, then you can get into the R&D intensive scheme and you chuck all your projects in there. So if you don't meet any one of those, so you're not an SME, or you're not R&D intensive, or someone else who's basically paying you to do the work, then you're going to need to be in the merge scheme. But it does mean for a lot of people, you can just say, I'm R&D intensive, it's all going in that scheme. As Mel mentioned, you can spend a lot of time historically going, oh, I've got this project, it was funded by Innovate UK, it now goes into a different scheme, to the SME scheme. All that gets swept away for accounting periods 1st of April 2024 onwards. So it is a welcome measure and could make quite a big difference. If you're claiming an Innovate UK grant and then you put an R&D tax credit on top of that, then you are getting a huge amount of your spend covered outside of your own cash reserves, effectively.
Thanks. And we've got a few questions on timelines here, and I don't blame anyone for getting quite confused by all these changes. And unfortunately, they're changes that are coming on top of many other changes that we've seen over the past few years, of the PAYE cap and all sorts as well. So, Richard, there's a lot of different points at which different rates apply. And you can claim or not claim for certain things. Could you take us through from April 2023 onwards, what rates can you get and what can you apply them to?
Thank you. I'm delighted to that question, Martin. So the research intensity threshold has come in for expenditure from the 1st of April 2023. Now, we can't submit tax returns on that basis. It's not, we haven't seen the final legislation, but companies, if they file claims over that span that period, can then refile once the legislation's finalised. So the 27p rate is available now, although it's based on the 40% threshold. For non-research intensive companies, and I'll keep to SMEs at this stage, they're now down at the 18.6p rate, again from the 1st of April 2023. We then move, the next changes are all not by reference to a specific date for accounting periods beginning on or after, and it's the same accounting period. It's the same date. So accounting periods beginning on or after the 1st of April 2024. Okay, so for most companies with December year ends, that'll be the 1st of January 25. That's the point when the research intensive rate stays the same, but the threshold comes down to 30%. But we then move into the merge regime, so that's where your 18.6% 8p in the pound reduces the 16.2p in the pound under the merge regime. Again, the numbers I've quoted are all on in-house expenditure. For contracted out expenditure, it's 65% of those numbers.
Thank you.
Companies
that are spanning where their financial year spans kind of 2 of those periods, how does that work?
So that really only applies for this current period where it's expenditure on or after. Otherwise, it's by reference to the full accounting period. But for this one, where we've seen the rate changes from the 1st of April, you have to essentially do 2 accounting periods. So it's not really acceptable to do a time apportionment. You should really work out your expenditure before the 1st of April and after the 1st of April, reference when your accounting period begins or ends.
Right. And this is being recorded, so you can watch this back later and watch that over and over again until you get it straight. Colin,
Colin's going to tell me where I got something wrong now, probably.
No,
so.
not at all. I'm gonna say, firstly, the BIA does not provide tax advice, and that's not a whinging caveat. That's because this stuff is hard. You need to go and either read the rules yourself or get some advice. It's very easy to go wrong on this stuff, and also that from a BIA point of view, there was this debate, and we debated as a Finance and Tax Committee, should we push to get the R&D intensive scheme and merger scheme in as soon as possible? Do we want to wait? And I know a lot of tax advisors have been saying, oh, there's been so much change, let's just wait. From our point of view, where we got to on balance was, let's just get on with it, because as soon as we get to this scheme, the government's now closed these reviews. It's just get the new rules in and everyone starts getting used to it and we get some stability, the better. We've had about 5 years of changes, PAYE cap and everything else going on. There's been a lot of confusion in the market, and it's not good, for the UK setting out its stall internationally to have this constant whirl of change. As soon as we get into this new world, we say, this is how it is. It does mean that, there's going to be quite a while of having to get advice and go, which year are we talking about again? And which accounting period, when did we spend it? What are we at that point? There's going to be some messy claims, and the revenue are going to have to pick their way through some messy claims. There'll be a lot of questions coming back from the revenue, but hopefully, in a couple of years' time, we go, we're now into the new rules. We've got HMRC guidance. Everyone knows where they are, and people have to spend less time thinking about this and more time going, let's get out last year's spreadsheet and do it again. But that is not where we are currently. Do not rely on last year's spreadsheet. You will go wrong.
Martin, can I pick up on the last question that's come in?
Yeah.
Which is around full expensing, and does that mean that capital expenditure can come into the R&D claim? And in short, and unfortunately not. So any capital expenditure, although you'll get tax relief for it up front, falls outside the regime. It is something that we have been lobbying for some time, and I'm pleased to say it's still recognised and acknowledged to be on the agenda by HMT, but so I think there's some further discussion to have around that potentially, but as things stand, no, it can't be included.
Thanks. And sticking with the eligible spend, where are we at with the cloud and data costs? When do they come?
So they come in, and I'm pretty sure, and Colin help me out here, they come in for accounting periods beginning on or after April 23.
I think so, but genuinely, I'd have to go off and check. We've had so much change. I think that's right, but I'd have to check it.
Yeah, this is really complicated stuff. So
I've just got a Teams message confirming that I was correct there. So thank you.
Who's saying it now? Where's the source for your data? Come on.
Right, taking us away from tax for a second, we've got a question whether we know the size of this British Business Bank growth fund, and whether there'll be a tsunami of cash or a steady flow. So no, we don't know the size of that fund. I mean, I think it's in the very early stages of being designed, but the idea is that pension funds and perhaps other types of investors would put their money into this fund, which would then start to flow, be allocated down, possibly into other venture capital funds, and eventually find its way into companies. So the amount of cash is obviously dependent to a large extent on whether pension funds and others do choose to put their money into that British Growth Fund. It will be cornerstoned probably by government money, but it won't be entirely government money. And we probably don't want a tsunami of cash. A slow trickle and then an increasing flow is probably what we want to see, so that the market has time to respond, and we don't create a bubble overnight.
Martin, maybe I can come in on that one. I mean, my sense is that particularly for defined contribution pension funds, as they grow, the conversations I've had with those organisations is as their assets under management get larger, they will look to do this in a gradated way. So I think you're right. It's more likely to be growing to a level over the next 10 years, rather than everybody do it in a one-er when we find a tsunami in year one.
Yeah, no, I agree. And someone's asked, Steve, I might throw this one to you.
Yes,
how
please.
does this compare to other countries we look at around the world who are also looking to support life sciences?
Well, I mean, I think that we've got a really competitive offer now, and the UK offer is not solely in the things that we've talked about today. It is a broader offer. Obviously, the fundamentals of our offer are that we've got a fantastic ecosystem of size and scale, which knows how to do and has success of building life science businesses that compete for the globe, based on fantastic science. We've got a great pool of fantastic people, and we're investing to make sure there's more of them. So it's usually great people, great science backed by the right amount of money at the right time is what gets companies to grow and scale. I think we've got rid of some of the things that were concerning people. Hopefully, as I say, we're into a period of stability. We're growing and building the venture capital community that knows and understands our businesses and invests in them. And we're building more domestic investors to go alongside fantastic international investors that are interested. So I think as long as and that enables the UK to be a great place to do this. The thing is, of course, you're going to need people who are probably outside of your business if you're starting or scaling. And the trick here is you've got those companies in spades. You can always find somebody in the network or another company in the network to do many of these things. Plus, we've got the linkage to the NHS and the NHS data, which again is a long-term project, but again, you can see the innovation that's happening. the responsiveness of the MHRA, even if they've had a tough year. So I think we've got a really competitive offer with unique opportunity, and we've obviously not got some of the cost base baked in that you see in places like Boston, and we have the advantage of both deep tech community and AI community in the UK. I always remind people Google have got their AI not in Silicon Valley but in London. This is really where our offer lies, and I think that's competitive. Obviously, you may get to go to the Elysee with Macron if you go to France, and if that's floats your boat, then that has there are some alternative offers out there. But I think we've tried to double down on a coherent strategic offer based around the things that we think can drive growth, and English language and a great place to be also helps.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a few more quite nuanced questions about the tax regime, but I'm going to kind of repeat Colin and say we can't offer tax advice to our members, but we will be publishing as much information as we can to help everyone navigate this, but probably best that you do seek professional tax advice as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. If you're not BIA members, you can join to support all this work that we're doing on behalf of the sector. And FTAC, our Finance and Tax Advisory Committee, is open for new members if you're interested in joining it and contributing to this work. Thank you very much for joining this event. Steve, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about upcoming events and say goodbye. But thank you very much to Richard, Colin and Mel for contributing today.
Yes, if I can add my thanks to Richard, Colin and Mel for all the work they've done on behalf of the association, and add to that my thanks to Martin for his excellent custodianship of this really complicated set of announcements this week. You've done a fantastic job in bringing this together in a understandable format, which is fantastic. We don't only get together online, and it's nice to see people in person. So if you're interested in bioprocessing, we've got our fantastic conference next week down in Brighton, 300 people for 3 days. I think we've got the last knockings there. Our Women in Biotech community are coming together on the 7th of December in London. That's a really fantastic network of leaders and people who are building their careers. Our gala dinner is sold out at the end of January. I would normally promote it and say it's the best event of the year. It is the best event of the year, but I can't sell you any more tickets because we're sold out. But that's why I would encourage you to get looking at what we've got on the website. If you want to come to Tech BioX in Cambridge, the committee summit is new in the thing. If you're interested in work of this committee and other committees, at the end of February, 21st of February, it's great. Diversity inclusion workshop on how you can get the most out of the immigration system is the end of February, and we'll be up in Cambridge for Women in Biotech. If you've got anybody who's an up-and-coming life science entrepreneur, then they'll be interested in Pulse, which stands for Programme for Up-and-Coming Life Science Entrepreneur, at the end of March, and we'd love to have nominations for that. Or if you consider yourself an upcoming life science entrepreneur, we'd like to see you at that one. Thanks all. Enjoy the rest of your day, and do give us any feedback. We really appreciate your participation.